What you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing true stories from the American Wild West. A tale so grotesque and shocking that for decades historians debated whether it could possibly be real. This is the story of a lawman who crossed the line between justice and madness. A sheriff whose obsession with preserving his legacy led him down a path of unspeakable horror. Before we begin, I need to warn you that this story contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing practices that some viewers may find deeply unsettling. But if you want to understand just how dark the frontier could truly be, if you want to know what happened when the thin veneer of civilization crumbled in the lawless territories of the Old West, then you need to hear about Sheriff Augustus Pike and the jars he kept in his office. Hit that like button right now, because this story is going to take you to places you never imagined the Wild West could go. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we're diving deep into the darkest corners of frontier justice. The year was 1873, and the Arizona Territory was a powder keg of violence, corruption, and bloodshed. Silver had been discovered in the mountains near a dusty settlement called Garrison Flats, and within months the population had exploded from a few dozen hardy souls to over 3,000 desperate fortune seekers, con artists, outlaws, and opportunists. The town had no real law to speak of, just a part-time marshal who spent most of his time drunk in the saloon, and the result was predictable chaos. Shootings happened almost daily. Bodies turned up in alleyways. Claim jumpers murdered miners in the hills. The decent folks who'd come to make an honest living lived in constant fear, and the territorial governor in Tucson was getting pressure from Washington to do something about the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. That's when Augustus Pike arrived in Garrison Flats, and from the moment he stepped off the stagecoach with his weathered duster and cold gray eyes, people knew something was different about this man. Pike wasn't like the typical frontier lawman of the era. He hadn't been a cowboy or a rancher or a prospector who'd taken up the badge to bring order to his community. No, Augustus Pike had been a soldier, a captain in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he'd seen things during that conflict that had fundamentally changed something inside him. He'd fought at Shiloh, at Antietam, at Gettysburg, places where the dead had been stacked like cordwood and the screams of the wounded had filled the air for days. He'd been part of Sherman's march to the sea, where the Union forces had deliberately destroyed everything in their path, burning farms and towns, leaving devastation in their wake. The war had taught Pike that violence, when applied with sufficient force and determination, could solve almost any problem. It had also taught him that mercy was a luxury that civilized places could afford, but that on the frontier of chaos, whether that frontier was the battlefields of Virginia or the lawless towns of the Arizona Territory, only brutal force would suffice. The territorial governor had personally selected Pike for the job in Garrison Flats specifically because of his reputation for ruthlessness. Pike had served as a lawman in 2 other frontier towns before arriving in Arizona, and in both places he'd brought order through methods that made even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. In a Kansas cow town, he'd executed 7 men in a single month, all of them shot down in the street without trial or due process. Pike's justification was simple. They'd been caught, red-handed in criminal acts, and frontier justice demanded swift action. In a Colorado mining camp, he'd broken up a claim-jumping ring by hunting down its members one by one and leaving their bodies displayed in the town square as a warning to others. The territorial authorities in both places had looked the other way because Pike got results. Crime dropped dramatically wherever he went. The good citizens could sleep safely in their beds. And if Pike's methods were extreme, well, these were extreme times. When Pike arrived in Garrison Flats, he immediately set about establishing his authority in the most dramatic way possible. His first act as sheriff was to walk into the busiest saloon in town at peak hours on a Saturday night and shoot dead 3 men who'd been terrorizing the community for weeks. Pike didn't announce himself, didn't give them a chance to surrender, didn't read them their rights or explain what they were charged with. He simply walked through the door, drew his pistol with practiced speed, and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. All 3 men dropped where they stood, dead before they hit the floor. The saloon fell into stunned silence. Pike holstered his weapon, looked around at the shocked faces staring at him, and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "I'm Sheriff Augustus Pike, and that's what happens to lawbreakers in my town. Spread the word." And then he walked out, leaving the bodies where they'd fallen. The message was received loud and clear. Over the next few weeks, Pike established a routine that would become infamous. Throughout the territory, he patrolled the streets of Garrison Flats day and night, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. He was a tall man, over 6 feet, with a lean, hard build that spoke of years of military discipline. His face was weathered and deeply lined, making him look older than his 42 years. And those grey eyes of his seemed to look right through people, evaluating them, judging them, deciding in an instant whether they were law-abiding citizens or potential threats. Pike wore his pistol low on his hip, tied down gunfighter style, and everyone in town knew he could draw and fire with terrifying speed. But it wasn't just his skill with a gun that made Pike so effective. It was his absolute lack of hesitation. Other lawmen might pause, might give a suspect a chance to surrender, might try to talk their way through a confrontation. Not Pike. If he decided you were a threat, if he determined you'd crossed the line from law-abiding citizen to criminal, he acted instantly and without mercy. The body count started rising immediately. In his first month as sheriff, Pike killed 11 men. Some were shot during attempted robberies or assaults. Others were gunned down when they resisted arrest. A few were executed in what Pike called preventive law. Enforcement, shot because Pike believed they were planning crimes even if they hadn't yet committed them. The townspeople were divided in their reactions. The merchants and families, the people who'd come to Garrison Flats hoping to build something legitimate, praised Pike's efforts. Crime was indeed dropping. The streets were becoming safer. Women could walk to church without fear of harassment. But others, particularly those who'd come to the frontier precisely because it was lawless, began to mutter that Pike had gone too far, that he wasn't a lawman, but a killer with a badge, that his version of justice was just another form of tyranny. Pike didn't care what anyone thought. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it his way. But something else was happening during those early months, something that wouldn't become apparent until later. Pike had started keeping trophies. After each killing, after each criminal he'd sent to meet their maker, Pike would search the body, taking any weapons, money, or personal effects. This was standard procedure for frontier lawmen. These items would be catalogued and either returned to next of kin or sold to cover burial expenses. But Pike was taking something else, something that nobody knew about at first. He was cutting off a small lock of hair from each dead man, carefully placing it in an envelope along with the date and a brief description of the killing. He kept these envelopes in a locked drawer in his desk at the sheriff's office, and sometimes late at night. When the town was quiet and he was alone, he would take them out and look through them, reading his own notes, remembering each confrontation, each death. This might have continued indefinitely. This macabre hobby of Pike's remaining his own private obsession, if not for what happened on a blistering hot afternoon in July of 1874. Pike had been sheriff for just over a year at this point, and the death toll had reached 47 men. Garrison Flats had indeed become more orderly, but it had done so at a terrible price. And Pike's reputation had spread throughout the territory. Outlaws and troublemakers gave the town a wide berth, knowing that crossing into Pike's jurisdiction was likely to be a death sentence. On this particular day, Pike was tracking a man named Silas Cobb, a drifter who'd been accused of murdering a prospector in the hills outside town. Pike had tracked Cobb to an abandoned mining shack about 5 miles from Garrison Flats, and he'd gone alone to apprehend him, as was his custom. Pike never deputized anyone, never brought backup, never asked for help. He worked alone, always. The confrontation at the mining shack went exactly as Pike expected. Cobb saw Pike approaching and opened fire with a rifle, forcing Pike to take cover behind a large boulder. For nearly an hour, the two men exchanged shots, Pike working his way steadily closer, Cobb growing increasingly desperate as his ammunition ran low. Finally, Pike made his move, rushing the shack while Cobb was reloading. The outlaw managed to get off one wild shot that missed Pike by inches before the sheriff's bullet caught him square in the chest. Cobb went down hard, mortally wounded but not yet dead. Pike approached cautiously, his gun still trained on the dying man. Cobb was coughing up blood, his eyes wide with pain and fear, knowing he had only moments left. And that's when Pike said something that would later be remembered by a prospector who'd been hiding nearby, too terrified to reveal himself during the gunfight. Pike stood over the dying Cobb and said, "Your number, 48. I'm going to make sure nobody ever forgets you, or any of the others. You'll all be remembered, I promise you that." Cobb died moments later, and Pike did what he always did. He searched the body, took Cobb's weapons and the few dollars in his pockets, cut a lock of hair and placed it in an envelope. But then Pike did something different, something he'd apparently been thinking about for quite some time. He pulled out a large hunting knife and went to work on Cobb's corpse. And what he did next was so disturbing that the prospector who witnessed it, a man named Henry Talbot, would later say it gave him nightmares for the rest of his life. Pike decapitated Silas Cobb. He sawed through flesh and bone with methodical precision, showing no emotion whatsoever, until the head was completely severed from the body. Then Pike wrapped the head in an old canvas tarp, placed it in his saddlebag, and rode back to Garrison Flats, leaving Cobb's headless corpse in the shack to be found later. When Pike returned to town that evening, he went directly to his office and locked the door behind him. He stayed there for hours, not emerging until well after midnight. And when he finally left, he carefully locked the office door and took the key with him, something he'd never bothered to do before. The next morning, Pike was back at work as usual, patrolling the streets, keeping order, showing no sign that anything unusual had happened. But behind the locked door of his office, sitting on a shelf that Pike had installed in a back corner, away from prying eyes, was a large glass jar filled with a clear liquid. And preserved inside that jar was the severed head of Silas Cobb, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. Floating in what Pike had learned from a medical book was a mixture of alcohol and formaldehyde that would preserve human tissue indefinitely. This was how it started. This was the moment when Sheriff Augustus Pike crossed from being merely a ruthless lawman into something far darker, something that would eventually shock even the hardened frontiersmen of the Arizona Territory. Pike had decided that the locks of hair weren't enough, that he needed a more permanent, more visceral way to preserve the memory of every criminal he'd killed. He'd spent months reading about preservation techniques, about how battlefield surgeons during the war had preserved specimens for medical study, about how museums in the East kept biological samples in jars for education and research. Pike had convinced himself that what he was doing was a form of justice, a way of ensuring that these criminals would never be forgotten, that their faces would serve as a warning to anyone else who considered breaking the law in his town. But in reality, what Pike was doing was feeding an obsession, a dark hunger that had been growing inside him since his days on the battlefield, where death had surrounded him constantly and where he'd learned to see human bodies not as sacred vessels, but as objects, things that could be used and disposed of as necessary. For the next several months, Pike continued his work as sheriff, and the body count continued to rise. But now, after each killing, Pike would take not just a lock of hair, but the entire head. He became skilled at the decapitation process, learning exactly how to cut through the vertebrae, how to minimize the blood loss, how to transport his grisly trophies back to town without attracting attention. He would perform these mutilations in remote locations, far from any witnesses, and he would time his returns to town for after dark, when he could bring his saddlebags into his office without anyone seeing what they contained. The collection grew steadily. 2 months after Silas Cobb, Pike added the head of a cattle rustler named Jake Morrison. A month after that came the heads of the 3 Dalton brothers, outlaws who tried to rob the bank in Garrison Flats and had been cut down by Pike in the middle of Main Street. By the end of 1874, Pike had 7 jars on his shelf, each containing a perfectly preserved human head, each labeled with a name and date in Pike's neat, military handwriting. The townspeople of Garrison Flats noticed that Pike had become even more solitary and withdrawn. He'd never been particularly social, but now he seemed to actively avoid any interaction beyond what was necessary for his duties. He no longer ate at the town's restaurants, instead cooking his own meals in a small room behind his office. He stopped attending church services, though he'd never been particularly religious anyway. He was seen less and less on the streets during the day, emerging mainly at night to conduct his patrols. Rumors began to circulate that Pike was sick, that the constant violence had finally gotten to him, that he was drinking heavily or using laudanum to cope with the stress. But those who encountered Pike during this period said he seemed perfectly in control, perfectly lucid, just more focused and intense than before. His eyes had taken on a strange quality, people said, as if he was looking at something the rest of them couldn't see. What nobody knew was that Pike was spending hours each day with his collection. He'd arranged the jars in chronological order, and he would sit in front of them, studying each face, reading from a journal he'd started keeping where he recorded detailed notes about each kill. He wrote about the circumstances that had led to each confrontation, about the tactics each criminal had used, about their last words, if they'd spoken any, about how long they'd taken to die. Pike was creating an archive of death, a comprehensive record of his career as a lawman and executioner. In his mind, this wasn't macabre or disturbed behavior. It was professional, methodical, a way of honoring the dead by ensuring they wouldn't be forgotten. Pike had convinced himself that he was doing something important, something that future generations would appreciate. He imagined historians studying his collection, learning from his experiences, understanding the brutal reality of frontier justice. He never considered that what he was really doing was feeding a pathology, a sickness that had taken root in his mind during the war and had been growing ever since, fed by every act of violence he committed, every life he took. The turning point came in the spring of 1875. A federal marshal named Robert Hayden arrived in Garrison Flats on routine business, checking in on the various territorial lawmen and filing reports for Washington. Hayden had heard stories about Pike, about the unusually high body count, about the sheriff's reputation for ruthlessness. But Hayden was a professional himself, and he understood that frontier law enforcement sometimes required hard men willing to do difficult things. He'd come to Garrison Flats expecting to find a competent, if overzealous sheriff, someone who might need to be reined in slightly but who was fundamentally doing good work. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hayden arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and immediately went to introduce himself to Sheriff Pike. He found the sheriff in his office, sitting at his desk, filling out paperwork. Pike was cordial but cool, answering Hayden's questions in clipped military fashion, providing the statistics and reports that Hayden needed for his files. The federal marshal was impressed by Pike's organization and efficiency. The crime rate in Garrison Flats had indeed dropped dramatically. The town was prosperous and growing. By all measurable standards, Pike was doing an exemplary job. But something felt off to Hayden, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Pike seemed too controlled, too rigid, as if he was constantly keeping himself in check. afraid that if he relaxed for even a moment, something dark might slip out. And there was a smell in the office, faint but unmistakable, a chemical odor that Hayden recognized from his days as a soldier during the war. It was the smell of formaldehyde, the preservative used by battlefield surgeons. Hayden asked Pike about the smell, making it seem like casual curiosity. Pike's expression never changed, but Hayden, who'd been trained to read people, noticed a slight tensing of the sheriff's jaw, a momentary flicker in those cold grey eyes. Pike explained that he'd been preserving some specimens, insects and small animals, a hobby he'd taken up to occupy his spare time. It was a reasonable explanation, the sort of thing many frontier residents did, collecting samples of the unique wildlife found in the territory. Hayden accepted the explanation, but his instincts told him there was more to it. He decided to extend his stay in Garrison Flats, to dig a little deeper into Sheriff Pike's activities. Over the next few days, Hayden quietly interviewed townspeople, asking about Pike, about his methods, about anything unusual they might have noticed. Most had nothing but praise for the sheriff. The town was safer than it had ever been. Pike was tough but fair. He'd cleaned up Garrison Flats and made it a decent place to live. But a few people, when pressed, admitted that Pike made them uncomfortable. There was something about him, they said, something not quite right. A saloon keeper mentioned that Pike sometimes came in late, at night after the place had closed, and asked for bottles of pure grain alcohol, claiming he needed it for medicinal purposes. A clerk at the general store noted that Pike regularly purchased formaldehyde, supposedly for his taxidermy hobby, but always in quantities that seemed excessive for someone preserving insects. And then there was Henry Talbot, the prospector who'd witnessed Pike decapitating Silas Cobb nearly a year earlier. Talbot had never told anyone what he'd seen that day, too afraid of Pike to come forward. But when Federal Marshal Hayden came asking questions, Talbot saw an opportunity to unburden himself of the secret that had been eating at him for months. He took Hayden aside and, in a voice barely above a whisper, described what he'd witnessed at that abandoned mining shack. At first, Hayden thought the prospector must be mistaken or lying. The story was too grotesque, too unbelievable. But Talbot was insistent, and as Hayden questioned him in detail, asking about specifics, about what Pike had said and done, the marshal realized that Talbot was telling the truth. The prospector had no reason to make up such a story, and the details were too consistent, too vivid to be fabrication. Something terrible was happening in Garrison Flats, and Sheriff Augustus Pike was at the center of it. Hayden knew he had to act carefully. Pike was a dangerous man, quick with a gun and utterly ruthless. If Hayden confronted him directly without evidence, Pike might simply kill him and claim self-defense. Frontier law enforcement operated in a gray area, and sheriffs had enormous latitude in how they performed their duties. Hayden needed proof, needed to see with his own eyes what Pike had been doing. He formulated a plan. He would wait until Pike left his office on patrol, and then he would use his authority as a federal marshal to conduct a search. It was technically legal, though ethically questionable. But Hayden's instincts were screaming at him that something was very wrong, and he'd learned to trust those instincts. His opportunity came on a Thursday evening. Pike left his office around sunset for his nightly patrol, and Hayden watched from across the street until the sheriff disappeared around a corner. Then he moved quickly, crossing to the sheriff's office and trying the door. It was locked, as expected. Hayden pulled out his lockpicks, a skill he'd learned during his years as a marshal, and within moments he'd defeated the simple mechanism. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him. The office was dark, illuminated only by the fading light coming through the windows. Hayden lit a small lantern he'd brought with him, keeping the flame low, and began to search. The front area of the office was unremarkable. A desk, filing cabinets, wanted posters on the walls, the usual accoutrements of a frontier lawman's workplace. But as Hayden moved toward the back of the room, the chemical smell grew stronger, and he noticed a heavy curtain hanging across a doorway in The rear wall. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled the curtain aside. Behind it was a small back room, no more than 10 feet square, and lining 3 walls were shelves. On those shelves were jars, at least a dozen of them, each containing a clear liquid, and suspended in that liquid were human heads. Hayden stood frozen, the lantern trembling in his hand, unable to process what he was seeing. The heads were perfectly preserved, their features clearly visible, their eyes closed as if in sleep. Each jar was labeled with meticulous care, names, dates, brief descriptions. Hayden recognized some of the names from wanted posters and newspaper reports. These were criminals that Pike had killed, and Pike had kept their heads as trophies. The marshal felt his stomach heave, and he had to turn away, gulping air, fighting to keep from vomiting. In his years of law enforcement, he'd seen terrible things, but nothing like this. This was beyond anything he'd imagined possible. Hayden knew he had to act immediately. He couldn't wait, couldn't go through proper channels, couldn't file reports and wait for authorization from his superiors. Pike was clearly insane, and there was no telling what he might do if he discovered that his secret had been exposed. The marshal left the office as quickly as he'd entered, not bothering to relock the door, and ran to the telegraph office. He sent urgent messages to the territorial governor and to his own superiors in the federal marshal's service, explaining what he'd found and requesting immediate backup. Then he went to the town's magistrate, a nervous little man named Peterson, and explained the situation. Peterson was horrified and immediately agreed to issue a warrant for Pike's arrest. With that warrant in hand, Hayden recruited 2 townsmen who owned guns and had experience in law enforcement, and together they went to find Sheriff Augustus Pike. They found him on Main Street, conducting his patrol as usual. Hayden approached with the warrant visible in his hand, the 2 deputized townsmen flanking him with their rifles. "Ready." "Sheriff Pike," Hayden called out when they were about 20 feet away. "I'm placing you under arrest on charges of mutilating corpses and conduct unbecoming an officer. I need you to surrender your weapon." Pike stopped walking and turned to face them. His expression showed no surprise, no fear, no emotion at all. He looked at Hayden for a long moment, then glanced at the 2 townsmen. "So you know," Pike said quietly. "I wondered how long it would take." His hand moved toward his holstered pistol, and for a moment Hayden thought Pike was going to draw, thought this was going to end in a gunfight right there on Main Street. But then Pike's hand stopped, hovering over the gun, and he seemed to reconsider. "I'm not going to fight you," Pike said. "What I did for good reasons. I'll explain it to the court, and they'll understand." He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. Hayden breathed a sigh of relief and moved forward to place handcuffs on the former sheriff. But Pike wasn't finished talking. As Hayden secured the handcuffs, Pike began speaking, his voice calm and measured, as if he were giving a report to a superior officer. "Every one of those men deserved what they got," he said. "They were murderers, thieves, rapists, the worst scum that ever walked the earth. I sent them to hell where they belonged, and I preserved them so that people would remember, so that future generations would see the faces of evil and know what had to be done to fight it. I'm not crazy, Marshal. I'm practical. I saw what needed to be done, and I did it. This territory is safer because of me. Garrison Flats is a decent place to live because of me. Everything I did for the greater good." Hayden didn't respond. There was nothing to say to a man who could rationalize such horror, who could stand there calmly defending his collection of human heads as if it were a public service. They took Pike to the town's small jail and locked him in a cell. Within hours, word had spread throughout Garrison Flats about what had been found in the sheriff's office. A crowd gathered, some calling for Pike to be lynched immediately, others demanding that he be given a fair trial. Federal Marshal Hayden positioned armed guards around the jail to prevent any vigilante justice, and he sent another telegram to the territorial governor, explaining that Pike was in custody and requesting instructions on how to proceed. The story of Sheriff Pike's collection became a sensation throughout the territory and eventually made headlines in Newspapers across the country. Reporters came to Garrison Flats, interviewing anyone who'd known Pike, writing lurid accounts of the ghoul sheriff and his chamber of horrors. The jars were eventually removed from Pike's office by federal authorities and destroyed, though not before several photographs were taken for evidence. Those photographs still exist in federal archives, and they remain as disturbing today as they were in 1875. Pike's trial was held in Tucson and lasted for 3 weeks. The prosecution argued that Pike had committed crimes against nature and decency, that his mutilation of corpses proved he was insane and unfit to serve as a lawman. Pike's defense attorney, a skilled lawyer from San Francisco, argued that his client had indeed been mentally unbalanced by his experiences during the Civil War, that the horrors of battle had damaged his mind, and that he should therefore be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Pike himself took the stand in his own defense, and his testimony shocked everyone in the courtroom. He showed no remorse whatsoever for what he'd done. He maintained that every man he'd killed had deserved death, that his preservation of their heads was no different from a museum keeping specimens for educational purposes, and that history would eventually vindicate his actions. "I did my duty," Pike said at one point, looking directly at the judge. "I brought order to a lawless place. I made the frontier safe for decent people. If my methods were harsh, it's because harsh methods were needed. And as for preserving the heads of those criminals, I was creating a record, a testament to the cost of justice. Every soldier who's seen battle knows that sometimes you have to do things that might seem brutal to those who've never faced real evil. I faced evil every day in Garrison Flats, and I defeated it. That's all I've ever done, defeat evil wherever I found it." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict. They found Pike guilty of mutilating corpses and abuse of his position as sheriff, but they also agreed with the defense that he was clearly insane. Pike was sentenced to be confined indefinitely in the sane Arizona Territorial Asylum for the Insane, a facility in Phoenix that had been established just a few years earlier. He was removed from the courtroom, still protesting his sanity, still insisting that he'd done nothing wrong, still claiming that history would remember him as a hero rather than a monster. The last thing he said before being taken away was, "The heads should have been kept. They should have been put in a museum. People need to see the faces of evil. They need to remember." Sheriff Augustus Pike spent the remaining 12 years of his life in the asylum. Medical records from that institution, which still exist, describe him as a model patient in many ways: calm, cooperative, intellectually sharp, able to carry on rational conversations about almost any topic. But he never wavered in his belief that what he'd done was right and necessary. He never showed any remorse or any understanding of why. Others found his actions so horrifying. The doctors who treated him diagnosed him with what they called moral insanity, a condition where a person understands the difference between right and wrong intellectually, but has no emotional connection to moral principles, no empathy for others, no ability to see human beings as anything other than objects to be used or discarded. In modern terms, we would probably diagnose Pike as having severe antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy, combined with post-traumatic stress disorder from his war experiences. But in 1875, the doctors had no real understanding of such conditions. All they knew was that Augustus Pike was fundamentally broken in some way that couldn't be fixed. Pike died in the asylum in 1887 of pneumonia. He was 56 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave on the asylum grounds, as was standard practice for patients who died without family to claim them. There was no funeral, no mourning, no acknowledgement of his passing beyond a brief notation in the asylum's records. The town of Garrison Flats tried hard to forget that Pike had ever been their sheriff. The building that had served as his office was torn down and replaced with a general store. The town eventually renamed itself Copperfield after a particularly rich copper strike in the nearby mountains. And today, there's no trace of the original settlement of Garrison Flats at all. But the story of Sheriff Pike and his collection of heads has endured, passed down through generations, becoming one of the most notorious tales of the Wild West. The question that historians and psychologists have grappled with ever since is this: was Augustus Pike a monster who used the chaos of the frontier to indulge his darkest impulses? Or was he a man who genuinely believed he was serving justice in the only way that made sense to him? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Pike was clearly mentally ill, damaged by his experiences in the Civil War and unable to process violence and death in a normal, healthy way. But he was also a product of his time, a period in American history when violence was commonplace, when life was cheap, and when the mechanisms of law and order that we take for granted today simply didn't exist in many places. The frontier demanded hard men, and Pike was certainly that. But he was also something more, something darker, a man who'd crossed a line that even other frontier lawmen recognized shouldn't be crossed. There are some who argue that Pike did bring order to Garrison Flats, that the crime rate really did drop under his watch, and that the town really did become a better place to live. These people suggest that we shouldn't judge Pike too harshly, that we should understand him as a necessary evil in a time and place where ordinary law enforcement simply wouldn't have worked. But this argument ignores the fundamental horror of what Pike did. There's a difference between harsh law enforcement and what Pike practiced. Other sheriffs and marshals of the era managed to bring order to frontier towns without keeping human heads in jars. Pike's collection wasn't about justice or deterrence. It was about his own psychological needs, his own inability to process the violence he was committing, his own descent into a darkness that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with his damaged psyche. The legacy of Sheriff Augustus Pike is a dark stain on the history of the American West. His story reminds us that the frontier was a far more complex and disturbing place than the romanticized version we often see in movies and television shows. Yes, there were heroes in the Old West, brave men and women who struggled to build civilization in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. But there were also monsters, people whose pathologies were given free rein in a place where normal social constraints didn't apply, where violence was common, and where someone with a badge could commit atrocities with little fear of being called to account. Pike was one of those monsters, and the fact that he wore a sheriff's badge, that he was officially sanctioned by the territorial government, that he genuinely believed he was doing good work, makes his story all the more chilling. What happened to the actual heads that Pike preserved has been the subject of much speculation over the years. The official record states that they were destroyed by federal authorities after Pike's trial, but there have been persistent rumors that at least some of them survived, that they were kept as evidence or as medical specimens, and that they might still exist somewhere in storage in a government facility or university collection. These rumors have never been confirmed, and most historians believe that the heads were indeed destroyed as the official records claim. But the fact that people still wonder, still speculate about whether these grisly relics might still exist somewhere, speaks to the enduring fascination with Pike's story. In the decades since Pike's death, his story has inspired numerous books, articles, and even a few movies, though many of these fictionalized accounts take considerable liberties with the facts. Some portray Pike as a tragic figure, a good man driven mad by war and the violence of the frontier. Others present him as pure evil, a psychopath who would have been a killer regardless of his circumstances. The truth, as is so often the case, is more nuanced than either of these extremes. Pike was a human being, complex and contradictory, capable of rational thought and efficient action, but also deeply fundamentally broken in ways that led him to commit acts of unspeakable horror. Understanding his story requires us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about human nature, about what circumstances can drive people to do, about how thin the line is between order and chaos, between civilization and barbarism. The people who knew Pike, who lived in Garrison Flats during his tenure as sheriff, had widely varying opinions about him even years later. Some maintained until their dying day that Pike had been a hero, that he'd saved the town from descending into complete lawlessness, and that his methods, while extreme, had been necessary. Others insisted that Pike had been a devil in human form, a man who'd used his badge as license to commit murder and mutilation. Interviews with survivors, recorded by historians in the early 20th century, show this divide clearly. One former resident, a woman named Sarah Morrison, said in an interview conducted in 1922, "Sheriff Pike was a harsh man, no doubt about that. But before he came, you couldn't walk the streets safely. Men were shot down in broad daylight. Women were afraid to leave their homes. Pike changed all that. He was like a wolf guarding the sheep, and yes, he was a predator himself. But he only preyed on other predators. What he did with those heads, that was wrong, and it showed he had something broken inside him. But I'll tell you this, my children grew up safe because Augustus Pike was our sheriff. And I can't bring myself to entirely condemn a man who gave us that." But another former resident, a man named Thomas Wright, had a very different perspective. In an interview from 1925, Wright said, "Pike was a killer, pure and simple. He liked killing. You could see it in his eyes. Every time he shot a man down, there was a kind of satisfaction there, a kind of hunger being fed. He wasn't keeping order. He was feeding his own sickness. And the heads, God, the heads. When we found out about those, when we learned what he'd been doing in that back room, it confirmed what some of us had suspected all along. Pike wasn't a lawman. He was a butcher with a badge. The fact that crime went down during his time doesn't change what he was. The fact that people felt safer doesn't excuse what he did. There are lines you don't cross, not ever. And Pike didn't just cross them, he obliterated them. Both perspectives have validity, and that's what makes Pike's story so disturbing and so enduring. He really did reduce crime in Garrison Flats. He really did make the town safer for law-abiding citizens. But the price of that safety was the unleashing of a damaged, dangerous man who committed acts that violated fundamental human decency. It's a stark reminder that the ends don't always justify the means, that there are some costs too high to pay even for worthy goals, and that we have to be very careful about the kind of power we give to law enforcement and the kind of men we choose to wield that power. The frontier might have demanded hard men, but it didn't have to demand monsters. And the fact that someone like Pike could operate with official sanction for as long as he did speaks to deep failures in the systems that were supposed to govern frontier justice. The story of Augustus Pike also raises questions about how we remember history and what we choose to emphasize when we tell stories about the past. For a long time, the history of the American West was told as a heroic narrative, a story of brave pioneers and noble lawmen taming a savage wilderness and bringing civilization to an untamed land. It's only in recent decades that historians have begun to seriously examine the darker aspects of that history, the violence and displacement and exploitation that accompanied westward expansion. Pike's story is part of that darker history, a reminder that the Old West was a far more complex and morally ambiguous place than the simplified myths would have us believe. There were no simple good guys and bad guys. There were people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and sometimes those choices led to horrifying outcomes. The psychiatric evaluation of Pike conducted during his trial and his time in the asylum makes for fascinating, if disturbing, reading. Dr. Samuel Winters, the chief physician at the Territorial Asylum, wrote extensive notes on Pike's case, and these have been preserved in archives. Dr. Winters noted that Pike showed no emotional response when discussing his killings, describing each one in precise, clinical detail as if he were describing hunting animals, rather than killing human beings. When asked how he felt about the men he'd killed, Pike reportedly said they were criminals. They'd forfeited their right to live by their actions. I felt nothing killing them beyond a sense of satisfaction at having done my duty. As for preserving their heads, I felt I was doing something important, creating a record that would educate future generations. I still believe that. I understand that others don't see it that way, but I can't help what others think. Dr. Winters wrote in his notes, patient Pike presents a unique case of dissociation between intellectual function and emotional response. He is highly intelligent, articulate, and capable of complex reasoning. Yet he shows no empathy, no remorse, no emotional connection to the gravity of his actions. He speaks of killing men and mutilating their corpses with less emotion than most men would show discussing the weather. When I attempted to have him imagine how the families of his victims might feel, he responded that criminals don't deserve families and that the families should be relieved that a dangerous element has been removed from society. Patient Pike's war experiences clearly caused severe psychological damage, but I believe there may have been predisposing factors, a fundamental lack of normal human empathy that the war merely brought to the surface rather than creating it. In my professional opinion, Patient Pike will never develop normal emotional responses and poses a continued danger to society should he ever be released. Pike's time in the asylum was marked by one incident that particularly alarmed the staff. About 3 years into his confinement, Pike managed to catch and kill a large rat that had gotten into his cell. The staff discovered that he'd hidden the rat's body and was attempting to preserve it using soap and water, the only materials available to him. When asked why, Pike explained that he wanted to practice his preservation techniques, that he was afraid he might forget how if he didn't keep practicing. This incident led to Pike being moved to a more secure cell and being watched more closely. It also confirmed Dr. Winters' belief that Pike's obsession with preserving the dead was not something he'd simply done as sheriff, but was a fundamental part of his psychological makeup, something that would likely persist regardless of his circumstances. The legal precedents set by Pike's case were significant. His trial was one of the first in the American West to seriously grapple with questions of mental illness and criminal responsibility. The verdict of guilty but insane established a framework that would be used in many subsequent cases. It also led to reforms in how frontier lawmen were selected and supervised. After the Pike case, territorial governors and federal authorities became much more careful about vetting candidates for sheriff positions, looking not just for men who were tough and competent, but for men who showed good judgment and moral grounding. The days of simply handing a badge to the toughest man in your town and letting him enforce the law however he saw fit began to come to an end. Though the process was gradual and would take decades to fully complete, the building that replaced Pike's office in Garrison Flats, the general store that was erected on the same site, had an interesting and troubled history. Several owners reported feeling uncomfortable in the building, describing a sense of unease and darkness that they couldn't explain. Some reported hearing strange sounds late at night, like whispering voices or the sound of liquid sloshing in containers. Skeptics attributed these reports to suggestion and imagination. People knew what had happened there, and their minds filled in the rest. But believers in the supernatural suggested that Pike's presence somehow lingered, that the terrible things he'd done had left an imprint on the location. The building eventually burned down in a fire in 1903, and the lot remained vacant for years afterward before finally being used for other purposes. Today, the exact location of Pike's office is unknown. The town of Copperfield that replaced Garrison Flats was itself eventually abandoned when the copper mines played out, and the site is now just empty desert with scattered ruins, none of which can be definitively connected to the original settlement. In the end, the story of Sheriff Augustus Pike is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, about what happens when we prioritize order and safety above all other considerations, about the thin line between law enforcement and vigilantism, between justice and revenge, between sanity and madness. Pike believed he was a good man doing necessary work in a harsh environment. He believed his methods were justified by the results they produced. He believed that history would vindicate him and that future generations would understand why he'd done what he'd done. He was wrong on all counts. History has judged him not as a hero, but as a monster. Not as a lawman, but as a serial killer with a badge. And yet his story continues to fascinate us, to disturb us, to make us question our assumptions about law and order, about civilization and barbarism, about human nature itself. The Wild West has given us many stories, some heroic, some tragic, some simply strange, but few are as disturbing as the tale of Sheriff Augustus Pike and the heads he kept in jars. It's a story that strips away the romantic mythology of the frontier and shows us the darker reality beneath, a reality where violence was commonplace, where human life was often cheap, and where the mechanisms of justice were crude and easily corrupted. It's a story that reminds us why the rule of law matters, why oversight and accountability are essential, why we can't simply trust that good intentions will lead to good outcomes. Pike had good intentions, or at least he believed he did. He thought he was serving justice, protecting the innocent, making the world a better place. But without moral constraints, without empathy, without a fundamental respect for human dignity, his good intentions led him to commit acts of such horror that even hardened frontier residents were shocked. His legacy is a reminder of what can happen when we forget that law enforcement must be about more than simply eliminating threats, that it must be guided by principles and values that acknowledge the fundamental humanity of all people, even criminals, even the worst among us. So what are we to make of Sheriff Augustus Pike over a century and a half after his arrest? How should we remember him? The answer isn't simple. We can acknowledge that he was effective at reducing crime, while also recognizing that his methods were abhorrent. We can understand that he was damaged by his war experiences, while still holding him accountable for his actions. We can recognize that the frontier was a uniquely challenging environment, while insisting that even in such an environment, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed. Pike's story doesn't fit neatly into the categories we usually use to understand the past. He wasn't simply a villain or a victim, simply evil or simply mad, simply a product of his times or simply an aberration. He was all of these things and none of them. A complex figure whose actions force us to grapple with difficult questions about human nature, about justice, about the cost of civilization. And perhaps that's the most important lesson his story has, to teach us that history is rarely simple, that the people who populate it are rarely wholly good or wholly evil, and that we do ourselves no favors by pretending otherwise. The truth is always more complex, always more disturbing, and always more important than the comfortable myths we tell ourselves. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for joining me on this dark journey into one of the most disturbing stories from the American frontier. This is the kind of history they don't teach in schools. The kind of story that makes us uncomfortable precisely because it challenges our assumptions about the past and about human nature itself. If this video made you think, if it disturbed you, if it made you see the Wild West in a new light, then please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you thought about Sheriff Augustus Pike and his terrible collection. Was he a madman or a product of his times? Could something like this happen today? What does his story tell us about the nature of justice and the dangers of unchecked authority? I want to hear your thoughts, your reactions, your perspective on this dark chapter of American history. And make sure you're subscribed to the channel with notifications turned on, because we're going to continue exploring the darkest corners of Wild West history, the stories that are too disturbing, too complex, too challenging to fit into the usual narratives, but that reveal fundamental truths about who we are and where we came from. The frontier wasn't what the movies show us. It was darker, stranger, more brutal, and more fascinating than we can imagine. And if you want to understand the real American West, not the sanitized version, but the truth in all its terrible complexity, then this is the channel for you. Until next time, remember that the past is never quite what we think it is. And the most important stories are often the ones that make us most uncomfortable. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop looking for the truth beneath the legends.